I bet that you stayed here not because my name is on the program, but because you set your Facebook app to say I'm a loser. You feel automatically on your Facebook if you leave. But thank you. So I'll try. I thought to myself throughout the day, if I'm last, how I'm going to do it in a way that it still keep everybody involved, and it came down to not asking you to read too much. So we'll try to do it in pictures as much as I can. So yeah, and that's not Excel, so we get to that. There is a point. So how it all started? I did my master's back at the Tel Aviv University about analysis of code of ethics, which had nothing to do with social media. But I did work on internet and website stuff, and when I moved to Minnesota for my PhD program, I was like, we need something new. And a very good friend who was a molecular biologist that said, networks are cool. There's probably something there in social science you can do with networks, and I really had no idea. So and although there was 40 years of more literature in sociology on social networks, I knew nothing about. My only knowledge about networks came from my friend and all the articles, or what they used to call then the Bible of networks. This is 150 pages article that Mark Newman posted like 6, 7, 10 years ago. So that's pretty much as I knew. He said, okay, why don't you start with links? So I was sitting at the bank at the Riverbay, that's the Mississippi, at the University of Minnesota, and reading. It was early 2003. School almost started. I tried to figure out what I'm doing, and I was reading it. And at one point, I started reading. And by the way, do you know what the difference between these two photos down there? Anyone?
Dawn and dusk.
20 years. So I was reading, talking about the network effect of the 1977, I think, blackout on the East Coast. And I came home staying with, not even home, I didn't even have a place yet in Minnesota. I just stayed with family friends and log into the dial-up to CNN.com, and it was early September 2003, which is the other photo, and I thought to myself, that's weird. I'm just reading about this blackout, the network effect, and I'm just coming home, and there is a blackout in the East Coast. I thought to myself, maybe it's a good sign. So school started, I tried to think, okay, communication, networks, and one of the very first classes I took, I really wanted to study online dating sites. I was new, in a new city, looking for love. News website, dating website were awesome. I really wanted a class project, but the professor for this class said, you have to work in groups. I was like, okay. Mid-semester, I have project almost done. I went, and then I learned my very first lesson. Work with a computer scientist if you don't know how to program. So I had a very great another person to that class, and Sean, and he wanted to do one thing, I want to do the other things. Somewhere in the middle, we decided to study newsgroups, political newsgroups, as network and part of replies. And 2003, that's pretty much what we had when it comes to social media. So we started working on it. And then I learned the second great lesson, and that was the first semester in graduate school. Lots of good things happens, just coincidence. You don't plan it, you don't try it, you just had to do it, and hey, it ended up being a good thing. Another very interesting, so I presented it in a paper in a social networks conference, where I met Mark, and Mark said, do you want data? And I said, found myself Microsoft Research a couple of years later, working on the NetScan data they had over there, where Mark was the director of the team, and it was a great experience of a lot of firsts. First, the very first huge data sets. And then you analyze, what was it before? Code of ethics for your master, there's not really lots of data going on. And even when we collected a few news groups and Google was keep flagging us and we're blocking our data. So having access to this great data, or my colleague dissertation in a box, was very interesting and fascinating and exciting, but also brought lots of, one of the great challenges that started there is that we have so much data, how do we make sense of it, but not only in the statistical, analytical way, but how to make sense of it in the conceptual, theoretical way. Especially when it comes to communication studies, we have quite a few good people doing network analysis, but it's really not a major theme of analysis. And since then, it's a challenge in every piece I'm publishing. Everything is coming from political communication and expand a little on for health communication, public relations. Some even games talk on Twitter. Weird things happen when you tend to tell your colleagues, I have data. So, so that's one of the challenges is since they're trying to figure out, because the data is getting old by the time it's published, unless you make a theoretical contribution, it will be really hard to sell your data. The other fun thing happened there is this little application they started developing there called Chung. Later became Node Excel, which was interesting because for a really long time network analysis was, first it never really gave you the data, there was issues importing, and while they became really evolved application for network analysis, it was really hard to use. And political communication was the context of the study. So I'm coming from communication research. And we come from a place so my question comes from what's going on around me. Traditional news media decline. Alternative information sources rise. New parts of new competition. Traditional news media try to or media organizations try to use social media mainly because everybody is there but not completely sure how to do it, whether they're successful, what is success, and how to measure this kind of interaction. And I was mostly fascinated that from a social perspective and a communication environment, we got to the place where everybody are users. If you're the New York Times, you're a user. If you are the president, you're a user. If you're an annual user, they're all user. So what happened that all these very different users interact? So the early work, as I said, was on political news groups. We looked at the networks of news group users and replies the network. We had lots of, 6 months was part of it. Actually, it was 6 years there of political and health conversations. This specific paper later on published as the discussion catalyst piece has 20 political news groups, and we find out that the idea of information searching, exposure happens in different ways. You reply to people, you interact, you respond to messages, you post hyperlinks. We find out that what is expected when you know that all networks, self-organized networks, get their power law. But from a communication perspective, it was fascinating to see that 2% of thread starters attracted more than 50% of the replies. And when they talk about these people that started this successful, these 2% that started this successful threads, 95% of them posted the link, 2/3 of them to traditional news media. Brought it to the context that yes, it's a whole new world of network and user interaction and so on, but ultimately, people, at least there was a large percentages appreciating people who bring information from elsewhere. And most of it came from traditional, credible, well, more or less, news media. I just put it here, not because it's nice and green and pretty, but because it will change. It was interesting to look that almost a quarter of them come from blogs and personal and user-generated content, but we see that overall, over the years, this part expands and the news media shrink for a variety of reasons. including the fact there are more sources available that provide that kind of information. By the way, just as a point, every time I bring something that's coming from an article in process, published, accepted, or any of these things, there'll be a little information down there so you know where it's coming from. After all, academics. So that was early work, and I start figuring out, okay, what am I interested? What is type of questions that I have? So already started talking about that. So we know this unequal distribution, long tail, you name it, and so creating new hubs. So it was pretty predefined who be the hubs in pre-internet, pre-social media times, your news organization, politicians, and so on. But now, who are becoming the hubs? There's these central people in the network. So it's one question I was interested in. There's a lot of excitement about social media as the Greek agora of everybody come and meet and discuss and express or exchange opinion and ideas. And several questions I had regarding that. First, how and do we share information sources with one another? Do we actually interact? And in self-exposure, and we all participate in exercise, self-exposure actually means selective exposure. Other question I find interesting were how do we select information sources on social media? We have a wide range of information sources you can choose from traditional media, from your types of news media, from sources for information, health, political organization, think tanks, local media organization, user generator, like Patch, mix of user and professional news media, politicians, you name it. How do we select that we can identify some patterns in information selection? So much of the work that I've done in the last couple of weeks was related to communication networks on Twitter. Few definitions. You all know what Twitter is. The way I see Twitter is a network of self-exposure. That's how I conceptualize it. Because every time you follow someone, you select to expose yourself to their content. You subscribe. Now, doesn't mean you read it. Anyone who has more than 10 people they follow on Twitter means that it doesn't mean you mean it. But anyone that ever had a subscription to a newspaper know that it doesn't mean you read it, that you subscribe to it. But it's not as higher threshold hit, but at least tell us something that you make some conscious decision to follow and expose yourself to that person's content. So there are several questions over there. First was like, at the very basic level, who are the big dogs? University of Georgia, dogs. Who let the dogs out? Can't really. Please spell it, D-A-W-G-S. Okay. We started some national work in our paper here with Mark, Birds of a Feather, Tweet Together. And so, by the way, another fun thing about working with Twitter, you can come with really fun names for articles. Techie, okay, the verge of techie, but really makes it a lot of fun. We find out, remember the 25% we had news groups around the mid-2000s? Well, we see that part is expanding here, the individual and small groups. National topics, which we had there as well. Traditional media also remain over there. Online news only about 20%. What else? Governmental website, a small percentage, but it also makes sense because sheer numbers-wise, we have less of them. Interesting that regardless, we still see that in the context of, is news media gonna die? No, but they may have to adjust themselves to a changing environment. Find that when they play a role, active role on social media, they are gaining or regaining their position as information sources. When we look at local elections with Derek and others playing in the same Twitter field, we find out that yes, grassroots still play a role, but also local media versus national media as well. So it was nice and pretty simple to identify the people with the hubs and the high degree. Some methodological challenges of defining, okay, what is high and the drop and the thresholds. But overall, it was interesting. Some interesting insights, but we really felt that, that it doesn't really give us the social context of the conversation. So the next step is what I like to call content in context. If you're gonna search for the healthcare, same-sex marriage, any politically hot, controversial topic on Twitter, you're gonna find out that people are, some people support it, some people against it, some people draw from tradition, from credible sources, others draw from less credible sources, and so on. Some offensive, others are polite. Find out a wide range of people and content. How that we're looking on social media without considering the social aspect of social media might be missing something. So we started doing with much of this research is before actually looking who are the big dogs. I should stop saying that. We start mapping who follows whom. The context of the conversations, the clusters that are created. And yes, you will always find clusters. You know why you always find clusters? Because you run an algorithm that tells you to find cluster, and it will find cluster because that's what the algorithm is doing. And that's what there are some measurements there that are trying to figure out if these clusters are meaningful. Modularity is one way to go with it. You decide it and you find out that the clusters are meaningfully separated and distinct from one another. You start looking at different aspects of this conversation, sub-conversations. So in Birds of a Feather, we look about 10 different topics around the 2010 midterm elections. Learn lots of valuable methodological aspects. For example, if you say global warming, you get the conservative, and if you say climate change, you get the liberals. So you need to be really careful when you choose the keywords to collect the data here. But overall, we find out having these blue-red clusters that we see across many national topics. Liberal talks to liberals, conservatives talks to conservatives. When we start thinking about back to hubs, the most connected people, it was like, okay, it's not really as meaningful to find out who are the most connected people in the entire network, but within these specific clusters. And we find out that across different networks, topics, and time, quite interesting findings appear. We find out that when it comes to, well, obviously red and black, again, this Georgia will have to, red and blue clusters. Red, the conservative clusters tend to be more denser, more interconnected than the more liberal cluster. Found out also across many topics that the conservative clusters users tend to draw primarily, the hubs tend to be clearly opinionated information sources, conservative-oriented bloggers, television hosts, and so on, while the liberal tend to be a mix of liberally leaning sources and traditional media. That's from State of the Year in 2012 piece that we are well, still open and will be called Tweeting Apart. Thank you, Mark. When we looked at and Ben, yes. And we also look at it with Derek on the gubernatorial elections in 4 different states. And we found out that while in the national level we have these right and left, liberal, conservative, red and blue clusters, on the local level they tend to have different characteristics of these clusters. One would be the local clusters, people that interact and interested in the local aspects of the election, so they mix local news organizations, candidates, political activists, and so on. That's down here. On the left of there, they tend to be much more interconnected, and a group of people interested in the more national aspects. So we chose the toss-up election. So we have some national interest as well. While the findings are not as surprising, what it does indicate is again the competition. We don't see as much competition of new types of user-generated blog-based political websites in the local level as much as we see at the national level. And if you read the few most recent the State of the News Media reports from Pew, you find out that indeed at the local level, especially television, newspapers are much much more problems. But especially TV, local TV station is one of the very few types of media that is still doing well. And I think in part the lack of competition so far with grassroots news organization might explain some of it. The method here of curving a topic network, identifying clusters if exist, and find out hubs and other characteristics of tweets, hyperlinks, and users in each cluster is not applicable only for political communication. There's a little project you work on Cancer Talk on Twitter to identify, and it was very helpful us to identify the different community or sub-communities that discuss the topic. Specifically, we found the core communities and the visiting community. The core community is people that talk about a specific topic. Here it was prostate cancer every week. The visiting group is like, they talk about it when their favorite news media, they follow, talk about it, they start a conversation, will die, or the favorite celebrity, and so on, which we found particularly important if you try to design specific messages, if for groups of people that this specific cancer is personally important, they involve in the conversation, the type of message you want to design, probably going to be someone different than people that are interested in this topic in much broader way and together with many other issues, health and other issues that they care about. So different communities pose different messages. So mapping these communities we found to be interesting as well. That was breast cancer. The community down here, is our core community. These people appear week after week after week after week. Other like Paris Hilton, the conversation with Paris Hilton and Rusty Rockets, which I had to Wikipedia because I had no idea what the guy is. I'm embarrassed to say. Again, different groups. One, they just love the celebrity, so if they say something, they repeat it, have a little conversation, and they forget all about it. And the idea of using cluster analysis to identify sub-communities, different groups of people talking about the same topic on Twitter. We found very helpful here as well. Within clusters, some of the things we found interesting to look at to identify the conversation was to find the people most mentions, most replied, the analysis of the hyperlinks. What about hyperlinks, you ask yourself? Well, good question. So, about 50%, I think, on average, of tweets actually using hyperlinks. This makes a lot of sense because in only so much you can say 140 characters. One way to identify the context and the content of a conversation is ask yourself, okay, where do people get information from? And where they send people to get information from. For a long time, we just look at the hyperlinks to find out where they come and do the basic content analysis where hyperlinks are going to, and the stories is wonderful and important. Another more automated approach to it is looking at domains. So we looked at clusters and found out in each cluster, okay, who the hubs are, maybe political or other content-related orientation of the message. And the other thing that relate to information sources is where do they send hyperlinks to. So when we went into the 2012 State of the Union, found out that the blue clusters was sent, the top domain they sent to was the International Justice Mission and the Barack Obama. And the red cluster, the National Review and Common American Journal. That brief look at it sees that the word patriot appears a lot on the webpage, which suggests something about the political orientation of the website. Again, several ways that you can go ahead and identify different conversation based on the different aspects and characteristics of users and their activity. And of course, word networks, I just talked briefly about it. People talk about it earlier. There is a hidden network in the in any data collection you get from Twitter, which is the pairs of words that co-appear in tweets. Again, if you want to learn something more about the context of the conversation without going to thousands and thousands of content analysis of tweets, is looking through the networks of words appearing on Twitter. That was Michelle Bachmann in 2011. If you recall, she gave, is that the one? Yes, she gave a conversation about something about that the founding fathers fiercely objected slavery. Which create a lot of buzz. And one things we find out when we map this network of keywords or of words by the clusters. So the blue lines are words that co-appear in the blue cluster, and the red lines are words that co-appear in the red cluster, the conservative clusters. It also gives you the different type of conversation that happens within, or at least themes of conversation that appear in different, among different groups of people. Okay, so let's conclude. How are we doing time-wise? Beautiful. Thank you. Let's conclude and some tips. So, yeah, it's like a bird on a cow, I think, isn't it? So approach to information sources was that when you approach content on Twitter, there are three aspects that I like looking at. One is the user description, second is the content of the tweet, and third is the hyperlink. If things about users as information sources and conceptualizing Twitter network as a network of self-exposure, users are information sources. Each of these can tell you something about the kind of information that people are subscribed to. Okay, words. Probably not so many, but hey, what you gonna do? We're addressing issues of not only self-exposure, but selective exposure. I find out that this methodological process helpful to making at least initial sense of conversation on Twitter in a wide range of topics, whether it's in health communication, political communication, gamer talks, public, you name it, okay? I found that this process doesn't really get you to the beginning to end in a paper, but really gives you a way to examine data sets and get some insights that help you organize and understanding the conversation. First, you get a topic network. Put the keyword in Excel and get the data. Second, run the cluster analysis. Find, do we have a subgroups of users that interact with one another more than others, and that these subgroups are meaningfully different from one another. Hence, check for modularity. Identify hubs by cluster. Analyze tweets by cluster. Everything you see here is, again, Excel is doing automatically. The URL and domain, the top talkers, top mention, top reply to. Don't forget the other network, the words pair of networks. Again, for the entire network and by cluster. To examine themes and conversation among the people who participate in that topic. Twitter is a network of self-exposure. Allow us to map the network, identify the major sources, to cluster by hub and characterize by different characteristics. I think I'm just repeating what I said in the previous, but nobody will notice because it's almost the end of the day. You know, when you study in class, you make something weird on the PowerPoint and you say, I just want to see that you're all awake and paying attention. So that's kind of an example for that. Oh, people talked about IRB. I thought it has nothing to do with what I talked so far, but I need to mention it because I think I came with the formula. So, when I first thought IRB, I want to do analysis of the Twitter data that I collect. It's publicly available. I say, don't worry. And they said, can you contact something on Twitter and ask them to permission to use the data? And I said, we need to meet. Lucky enough, a colleague, his wife used to be the head of IRB. She said, okay, we need to meet. Two things you need to know about IRB when it comes to existing data. They're supposed to follow the law. While in practice, they're quite often trying to cover all possible bases. The Human Subject Act, or something along these lines, indicates very clearly that if data sets, first, publicly available, B, people that the information is up there should not have expectation of privacy, it's not this content is not considered human subjects. If it's not human subject, it doesn't fall under the Human Subject Act, and therefore not under the IRB's jurisdiction. There's a hidden form for most IRBs that often you will not find on the website called the non-human subjects form. They will send it to you. I went through the same process from the Twitter for YouTube. and networks, and for the public pages of public pages on Facebook, because I teach the classes analysis 3 weeks. If we need to go to IRB, my graduate students cannot complete the paper and publish it. So I have this done before class, just give them the names. What I did, I make the argument it's publicly available, which it is. I went to the statement of terms of condition and privacy, and all three will say, believe it or not, if you make it public, it's public. And it's a beautiful sentence, because if you that shows when they click I agree, they have no expectation of privacy, because they agree that if they make it public, it's public. While it sounds stupid, it's helpful. And that's pretty much I was able to go to IRB. They pretty much told me we don't need to see ever anymore. When it comes to, and that's very helpful for my research, and very helpful when I'm working with graduate students and we run projects in class. So, if there's no expectation of privacy, and the data is publicly available, IRB should approve it as non-human subject. A project will save you a lot of time, trouble, and mental well-being. Questions? Thank you. Please.
You talked about showing the word network
Yep.
in Twitter, and I was wondering if there was A, capability to add software lists,
Yes.
and B, capability to do topic modeling, so you can model the network between topics.
No.
It depends.
What? Well, at least I'm not familiar. You can edit the stop list and add more words. For me, one of the great important things to add is the keyword that I use to collect the data. I mean, that's basic than that, because it will not be there. So yes, and that you can do quite easily. You can, when it comes to, you can run any, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you can write any of the network analysis procedures. You can write on the social networks, on the word networks. So characteristics of specific nodes, of relationships, density, clusters, all these things you can run. Everything you run social networks, you can run on word networks. More advanced word modeling, I don't think so, right? Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I wanted just to hear more about how you're doing the hyperlink analysis.
Okay.
Just how are you finding the original domain?
So that's actually something that we just figure out in the last couple of weeks. So you get a short URL, and so it needs to go to the process of expanding it. When you download the data, it asks you, do you want to expand the URLs? If you click yes, it takes a little more time, but then it expands the URLs to the most of the time for the original one, depending how many times they were compressed. Sure. Exactly. And it will first it will show you the original in the spreadsheet and counts the top hyperlinks in general and by cluster. The next step it can do, if you want, it will chop it to the domain, because for me, domain being like CNN.com or NewYorkTimes.com. And the reason I was particularly interested in that is that first, the frequencies will be much higher and therefore more meaningful, because there's only so many times a URL will co-appear in a data set. And the reason they appear many times is probably because they were retweeted a lot. Now, if you chop it down to the domain, you can learn more about hyperlinks used as reference to the type of information sources in general. So if one gets a lot of, one cluster talk about immigration, people primarily look for all kinds of non-profit advocacy, human rights, civil rights organizations, and the others will go primarily to conservative bloggers and Fox News. So there might be lots of specific stories there, but chopping it down to the domain actually tells you more about the kind of sources they're drawing from. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yes?
Going back to your selective exposure, that is it. Can you tell me whether do you have a conclusion about whether people are getting selective exposure?
Yes. First, I'll define the selective exposure. In one context, it's primarily selective exposure in the context of political, in terms of politically biased or oriented information sources. So I can tell you what we find across time and the interpretation of whether it's selective or not. I mean, I guess it's open to interpretation. We definitely see that among the conservative users in quite a few networks of political, on political topics, we find out draw primarily from clearly a defined or identified conservative sources when it comes to hubs. With liberal, we see it depends. If it's a hot topic that news media talk about it, we'll see a mix of what we call mainstream media. You conservative, you may call it the elite liberal media, but what we usually see is as mainstream media and political, either pundits or columnists or newspapers and so on. If it's not in the news, you will find out that the liberal clusters tend to follow primarily information sources that are more liberally oriented bloggers and others, simply because just not in the conversation of the mainstream.
I guess I'm wondering what the comparison point would be. Is it? Seems like I want to know: are people's exposure on Twitter more or less biased than their exposures somewhere else? So the against Cowan Shapiro argument.
Well, and of course, that's always the question, and you hear it a lot, is that no matter what happened, you'll be more exposed to more sources of information online than offline. When as a mass communication scholars, I always compare it to pre-internet days. To pre-internet days.
Yeah.
85% of Americans watching one of the three major news broadcasts in the evening. Today, I don't know what to compare it to, honestly. TV, I think we have some things from Pew that suggest that we have similar patterns over there. However, if there's actually a piece that I read, well, NPR, listen. Recently suggested that still the major network news sources still gaining much of attention from the population. So if we make this agree that they provide some of a more balanced news coverage, so they may get it from there as well. So I think if we compare it to the TV, for example, my sense, I haven't studied it myself, they probably get more of a diverse source of information. But the question is, what do you compare it to, which I'm not sure how to answer. What would you compare it to?
Your neighbors.
Okay.
I don't know. It's some fictitious alternative of what we could have if we turned off the internet.
A random model. Yeah, I don't. It's hard to find a baseline these days. That's methodologically and conceptually, I guess, would be the case. Yeah. Please.
Sorry, I have another question, just in terms of selective exposure and how we understand it. I mean, if a user how are you defining? My understanding of selective exposure is that you tend to seek out the sources that are consistent with your views. How do you know that someone is a liberal, or forgetting who they're following, because I don't necessarily even buy that. So, I mean, I know that that's an argument, but this idea that, if you're following Obama and Romney, for instance, so there's a problem, right? That's in terms of how you operationalize that.
Oh, it's wonderful. It's not a problem if you follow both of them, if you ask me, but yeah.
Right. Okay. Sorry. Yes, we're sort of that's sort of making the point, but nevertheless, you do have to identify. You do have to pin down someone's ideology, right, in order to do this. So, do you have thoughts on that?
So let me recap if I understand the question. You're asking, how do I know if they? Oh.
Because you're
do I
talking
know
about what's saturated in this.
do I know the user's political orientation? In the first paper, that's what we did. In the Birds of a Feather, we went through all the content analysis of all of them. Now, it's obviously statistics. I mean, it's not that 100% of them follow, but we find out the vast majority in each cluster were either showed. I'll take it back. In most of the topics we examined, we find out that in these clusters we had, in one cluster, the vast majority were expressed one way or another, either through the tweets or the self-description, conservative orientation or liberal orientation in the other cluster. Some topics did not. Things that I'm trying to bring the back of my mind, but we find out that some topics were more information-based, so people were not necessarily expressing strong political orientation, but they just wanted to learn about the topic. But the more controversial the topic is, the more relevant. So in the Birds of a Feather, we actually looked. So we didn't only examine, if you like, selective exposure. We also examined homophony. People trying to interact with similar, like-minded people. In the most recent study, we felt that once we established it, we didn't really went manually content analysis of all the tweets in each cluster, but we used some of the automated options we have there, which associated with the hyperlinks, the domain that they post. And the major source of information in its cluster. So we did it in one study, we didn't do it in the other. Does that answer?
Yeah, I think.
Please.
I think I understand.
Yeah. Just in some of the studies, we did examine all the tweets to find out that hey, all of these people are conservative people, and conservatives, and most of the people are liberal. In a more recent study, we were just interested in the major source of information, so we did it. Okay. Thank you so much, people. If you have any questions.